And we hope that's okay with everybody, because there are people who couldn't come and will want to see it separately. Okay, Andy, back to you.
Thanks, Michael. And welcome everybody again for the, I don't know, to this meeting, out of however many you've joined. Thank you for your patience and perseverance, and congratulations for getting here. I think you've been set a test and a challenge to get here this afternoon, and you've all passed it, and who knows who didn't manage to. So absolutely, it's great to see so many people here, and kind of speaks, I think, to the timeliness of this publication by Michael, Bob, Naomi, and Janice that we're here to discuss around levelling up and the role of planning. I think this report, as by way of a little bit of background, if that's okay, this report comes out of kind of ongoing discussions that a group of us have been having relatively regularly since the government announced their plans to reform the planning system, whenever that was. And we produced two reports, which were also published via the TCPA's website. One was entitled "The Wrong Answers to the Wrong Questions," and one, "The Right Answers to the Right Questions," at that time, which a lot of colleagues, a number of whom who I think are here today, were involved in writing bits of. And those conversations have continued with a real sense of concern about the current government's agenda and its understanding of planning and of the role that planning potentially can play. And this pamphlet kind of came out of those discussions, I think, to some extent, being led expertly by Bob, with a view to trying to kind of present a critical perspective and some alternative understandings of the role that planning might play in dealing with some of the major kind of crises that the governments are responding to at the moment, and really we feel, and would feel, I guess many people here probably would agree, that should be responding to very differently than they are. I'm not going to say much more than that by way of introduction, because I'll pass over in a second, I think, to Janice initially, and then to Bob and others, who will talk through some aspects of the pamphlet that we hope you'll have had a chance to read. We don't want to talk at you too much, particularly after the last half hour of trying to get this far. And we want to have lots of space for discussions and questions about the issues and about the pamphlet. So as in a role as chair, what I'll do is keep an eye on the chat. And what I would suggest is that if you do want to come in, if you do have questions, if you do have comments, that if you pop them into the chat here on Zoom, then we'll keep an eye on them, and we'll once the presentation part of the session is out of the way, we'll call on people who have added their comments into chat, and I'll do my best to keep on top of that with 86 people chatting away. So that's kind of how things will run. Hopefully, as I said, not too much presentation, but enough to set the context, set the scene, give you an idea of the arguments. So without any further ado, I'll pass on, I think, to Janice, who's going to talk us through initially some of the kind of the pamphlet as it sits. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Thank you. Thanks, Andy, and thanks everybody for joining us. If I could just have the next slide, Michael. What we wanted to do in this pamphlet was go back to just remind ourselves about what the planning system is for. And although, you know, it's well known to all of us, we felt that in the white paper last year, the kind of indication from the Prime Minister that he wanted to remove the 1947 Act needed some consideration. Now, we have seen some comments since then that perhaps that isn't going to happen, but nevertheless, we do think it's important just to remind ourselves about the purposes of that Act. Because it was about a planning system which was about the use of land and buildings that benefited society as a whole, and that it was undertaken, those decisions about the use of land were undertaken in a democratic way. And I think that if we think about the potential of removing the 1947 Act, then there are real issues there, because the 47 Act, if you remember, established the principle of development in compensation, if you like, for taking away owners' rights to determine the use of their land and their building without any control or minor controls. And we felt that that really hadn't been thought through. And if that 47 Act was removed, it would bring uncertainty, there'd be a lack of investment, and it would increase uneven development, because only those sites and buildings that really had a very strong economic position would actually be the ones that received development and interest. But of course, planning is about all land uses. And again, we've rather forgotten this, because there's been such a major focus on planning for housing sites, which has gradually increased over the last 10 years. And we want to see planning going back to thinking about all land uses, and thinking about the need, thinking, for example, of employment sites, and thinking around community services and sustainable transport. So it's really important that we have planning for all of those things, rather than just, if you like, thinking about what the government's approach might be. So I'm now going to hand over to Michael. But Michael, I think you might be using the wrong version of the PowerPoint. I think you might be using version 1 and not version 2.
Shall I go back and correct it?
I think, because otherwise Bob's slides won't be on it.
Okay, just
Sorry.
Are you managing, Michael, or will we just go ahead with the slides that we have to keep things
I think we're
flowing?
going to have the slides we have, and then we can switch to the other one when we get to the end of this one.
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, so shall I speak to this, Janice, or do you want to?
If you could speak to that, Michael, it's
Yep,
just that it won't
fine.
have the changes in.
Yeah. Well, on the issue of housing, which I was asked to contribute to in this pamphlet, I think that housing is in a way a local issue, but in a way an aggregate nationwide issue. And the British government has got it all completely wrong. I mean, the housing system in Britain is a system which, especially in the last 20 years, is an enormous generator of inequality. I mean, it reflects inequality, as you would expect in a society with growing inequality of income and wealth. Then housing is delivered through the market. So the rich get as much as they can afford, as much as they want, and the poor get less and less. There is bound to be that inequality. But also it reproduces and amplifies the inequality, because as house prices rise, the rich get progressively richer. And I mean, I'm a good example. I'm now in my retirement and ridiculously rich as a result of the escalation of house prices. And the poor get poorer, partly because they're not participating in this wealth distribution from house price growth, but because they're paying rents, and rents have tended to rise and be high. So the housing issue is crucial, both as a national aggregate macro problem and as a local inequality problem, because it amplifies the regional disparities between regions in which house prices and land values are growing fast and those in which they're slow or declining. And planning is clearly going to be absolutely crucial in re-regulating the housing system in such a way that these inequalities are reduced, or indeed, perhaps even one day reversed. Let's be ambitious. Finally, I'd say on the housing issue, and there's more in the chapter of the pamphlet, of course, that minimizing and adapting to global warming will need all the planning skills that we have in order to think how to occupy this appalling housing stock that we've inherited. I mean, a housing stock which is out of date, on average older and more decrepit, more drafty, less well insulated than most of our European friends. We're going to need all our planning capacity to think of ways to retrofit and manage all this stuff and live in it in a way that's harmonious with dealing with global warming. So the housing issue is very important in all this. And I think I should stop at that point and hand on to Tim, who's contributing on the economy issues.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Right, my second version of this to a few of you who heard some of it before. As Janice has said, the 47 system was meant to be a sort of general system for if the word would be sort of integrated and sustainable planning. That's roughly what it might be described as now anyway, which means that development happens in the right places with up-to-date reasons for that placing of new development. Oh, right, we've lost something.
Just
You
can keep going, Tim, whilst Michael tries to. Yeah.
You keep going for a minute. I was trying to.
Okay, so and the planning system has had a role since 47 really of protecting land for different uses, and whether that was in local contexts like shopping parades and central parts of cities, or whether it was in terms of allocating industrial or employment uses land in relation to communities. Now that has been gradually stripped out over many years, but particularly the last 10 years. And so the possibility of planning for the economy, which is what my section is about, is becoming more and more difficult, really, with the extension of permitted development rights. And this is very obvious with, for example, in the new use class system and the way in which that operates, that the councils have much less control over what happens in, for example, the high street. So what I'm saying is that the challenge that levelling up is which is really about improving places for everybody across the country, in my conception, is going to be just made more difficult by the weakening of the planning system, but it could be made much easier by a re-strengthening of the planning system, updating of the planning system, and that's what the planning reform should be about. Okay, I think we're flipping through to the next person, which is Bob.
Bob, can you come in and speak to this slide?
Yeah, apologies. Yeah, my section of this report is about local government. I mean, you can't really talk about planning in the UK without talking about local government. And local government is absolutely key to not just delivering a planning service, but a range of other services. They're really fundamental to the quality of life in places. And therefore, any discussion of levelling up without discussion of local authorities and their role as public service provider, and within that as responsible for planning, often these public services, but a range of other things as well. It just makes no sense at all to talk about levelling that up without addressing that question. But there's no way in which local authorities are able to deliver on a levelling up agenda with the kind of cuts that they've had to experience over the last 10 years, almost up to 50% in some places in terms of delivering basic services. And unless these basic services are restored, it's really a joke to talk about levelling up. It's also a joke to talk about levelling up if you don't have a planning system that can be both democratic and actually can deal with questions of the distribution of land uses and so on. And that means that councils need to have properly resourced planning departments and resources that are not just gained from, you know, sort of bidding wars with other authorities, but have mainstream grants and mainstream allowances from government so that they can actually deliver on trying to reverse the changes that have taken place in the past, and also being able to kind of organize some local levelling up agenda. Because without local government engaged, there will be no local levelling up agenda. And my final point really is about democracy, is that, you know, when we talk about democracy in this country, to a large extent, whether we like it or not, it's about what local government does and how it does it. And retaining the sort of democratic element of local government is absolutely crucial. Local government without democracy is really not going to give us the kind of levelling up future that we want. And therefore retaining the democratic tier of local government, resourcing it properly, and ensuring that it's genuinely democratic has got to be fundamental, not just local government as an agent of delivering central government policy, but having an independence to be able to undertake things in accordance with what local people want. Okay, that's.
I shall try and find the.
So with Naomi, were your comments up next? Do you need the slide, or are you happy to speak to that whilst Michael digs around the other PowerPoint file?
I can talk about climate change and planning if you want me to start, Michael.
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
Maybe if you can, Naomi, yeah. That would
yes,
be
maybe that would be good.
Thanks.
Okay. So excuse me, because I've got a bit of a cold at the moment, so I'm hoping my voice will last for the 5 minutes I need. So I think there is there's no sense other than panic that I feel when I contemplate the planning system in England and think about how we're going to tackle climate change, because we're really not doing enough. And the government's net zero strategy, as Chris Stark pointed out on Twitter today, the government hasn't agreed with the CCC's suggestion of a net zero test for new developments. And he's saying, well, it's not clear how we can therefore avoid locking in new high carbon developments. And I think the national planning policy framework in particular is a really big gap in all of the government's kind of policies that it's released recently around what it's going to do to get towards the net zero strategy. And in fact, every reference to the national planning policy framework is like, we will consult date and specified on what to do about planning for climate change. And that's obviously a really big risk, because the planning system is the place where we kind of all agree what needs to be done. And the planning system is also there to create that level playing field and to insist on those requirements so that we're all kind of going in the same direction of travel that we need to go in. And I think that without really fundamental look at what the national planning policy framework is doing, we're not going to achieve those climate changing or climate change initiatives that we need to achieve in every sort of development decision that's happening in England and in every local plan. And the really big thing that is obviously missing is that our local plans and strategies and our development decisions are not specifically linked to the Climate Change Act. So there's going to be lots of things that don't happen unless we have the requirements in the planning system. And how does that all fit into the levelling up agenda? Well, we're still going to be making lots of decisions that are going to cost us a lot in the future, and they will cost those amongst us who have the least in society the most, because they're going to be at the forefront of living through those impacts and not being able to deal with the impacts of, for example, heat, of, for example, flooding, of not having access to renewable energy that's created here. All of those sorts of issues are going to have equality impacts. And I think that just my final point would be on the kind of Green Industrial Revolution plan that the government came out with last year in November 2020. a lot of that was focused on big bits of kit, so offshore wind, low carbon hydrogen and nuclear power, not really the sort of stuff that maybe distributes benefits more broadly across society, such as more community-owned renewable energy, more local government initiatives. And I think it's the same for zero-emission vehicles. There's lots of funding being put into charging infrastructure, but no mention about planning and how that connects together. So it seems to me there's lots of disparate initiatives, but a big gap where the planning system could be doing an awful lot to help with levelling up on the climate agenda.
Thanks, Naomi. That's fantastic. Michael, how are the slides coming along?
Well, I can try to end the screen sharing and open the later version of this slideshow, and I'm sorry to have got that one wrong.
That would be great. Apologies, folks. If you've got lots of questions or thoughts or comments based on what you've heard so far, then do pop them in the chat and we can keep track of them and bring people in afterwards.
Okay, so this is the revised slides to which Bob was going to speak in the final bit of the presentation before we switch to discussion. Okay, can you see that?
Not right now, no.
No, okay.
Bob, did you want to? Oh, here we go. I think we're in business.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, this short set of slides is really a way of kind of summing up, I think, what the pamphlet is really kind of driving at, and why it's important to do this sort of work and other work. And I guess we're sort of, the pamphlet's focused on a kind of fundamental contradiction, really. This decade-long attack on planning, scapegoating planning, and even telling it to get out of the way so the market can do what it needs to do. That's increased inequalities, both spatial and non-spatial. And yet government is now professing a goal of levelling up to tackle the very inequalities it has created. So this is a kind of fundamental contradiction. Because the goals of levelling up and climate change, tackling climate change, if they're serious goals, and it's still questionable whether this government is serious, requires more planning, not less, more planning democracy, not less, more control of the market, not less, more attention to spatial distribution and spatial justice, not less. But this is our fear, that this is unlikely what we're going to get. We fear the planning reforms that are in the pipeline will continue deregulation, will emphasize speed up, and the support for the house builders. Yet they will most likely be spun as levelling up. And almost anything that the government does from now on until the general election will be spun as levelling up. So this is a sort of what we're faced with, to be honest. So the next slide, Michael. Now, the case for renewed planning system has been made by, in the previous slides in many ways, and this just kind of summarizes it. I mean, the government approach appears to be so far is sort of pork barrel politics, put money, levelling up money, quote unquote, into the red wall seats and other Tory seats in the 2019 election. And also to, of course, encourage property investor-led development, which they've always done. So any serious approach to spatial planning has got to say, that's not the way to undertake spatial planning. There must be an unbiased funding program for levelling up. I mean, this is a concept which the government might find it very difficult to grasp, the idea of an unbiased local funding system for levelling up. But that really is got to be the test. And that means planning playing an integrating role, evidence-based, not, you know, sort of pork barrel based, an integrating role in public and private investment. Because unless you have that planning playing that integrating role, you know, where is the best place to put private or public investment? There has to be some system, a logical, rational system for deciding where investment should go, both public and private. That's really planning's role. So this requires more planning and more planning democracy. And then the next point is about land value, that the big challenge of the 1947 Act and beyond is what to do with land value created by planning consents. And at the moment, what's happened is that all of that money is leaked out to landowners, investors, and developers. 90% of it leaks out to them. And any serious approach to levelling up would actually reverse that completely. So that perhaps 10% would go to landowners, investors, and developers, and 90% would go back into communities and local government. And putting that windfall back really would be an approach to levelling up, because it would be a vast amount of resource then available to communities and local government to undertake interventions of levelling up. And the next slide has really been partly covered by Michael, is the housing market is fundamental here. And unless the government's serious about tackling the housing market, in particular, a massive program of social house building, that's essential. Unless you have that, you cannot level up access to generally affordable housing. No amount of fiddling with low-cost home ownership is going to level up access to genuinely affordable housing. You've got to have a massive social house building program. That's got to be one of the other tests that we're going to put down in front of the government. Unless you do this, you're just wasting everybody's time. You're pretending, you're making things up. And then the talk of healthy towns, a great, brilliant idea. The TCPA and other bodies are promoting this. And, this is a very ambitious and wonderful thing to do, particularly post-COVID. But it's impossible to actually think about that being effective without a strong planning system. It can't be just done by laissez-faire or by sort of, deals done with local authorities, particularly local authorities that the government likes. It has to be done with a serious planning intent. And then Naomi says, the climate response simply cannot be even and equal without a strong democratic input, because there will be a climate response from this government, but the likelihood is it will be highly uneven and unequal. And the only way that can be counted, many ways it can be counted, but one way in which it can be counted is through a democratic planning system. That should be its purpose, to make sure that climate response is even as it possibly can be in dealing with things like land use, housing, transport planning, and low carbon regulation. And then, of course, as Tim said, the expansion of PDR has to be reversed, or else it's difficult to take these discussions about levelling up seriously if we're going to carry on expanding PDR through our town centres and other places. So the final slide, Michael, is really a kind of way of what needs to be done. And this is a very difficult one, of course. This is a serious politics project. And, there are massive challenges of spatial inequalities and climate crisis we're faced with now. The government's ideology is really not compatible. In fact, it's almost in complete contradiction with this idea of reversing the capture of planning by the finance property sector. But really, unless you're prepared to entertain the reversal of the capture of planning, it's hard to see how you can begin to challenge spatial inequalities and climate crisis. So how does one even begin to do that politically? Well, we don't know, but at the very least, a coalition of environmental community groups, local government, planning professions, and social justice groups must demand, amongst other things, the reinstatement and enhancement of democratic planning, so that levelling up and climate action can be taken seriously. Thank you. That's the end of our presentation. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Bob, and everybody else for the presentations, which I hope have set the scene in relation to the content covered in the pamphlet. There are a number of questions coming in already, which I'm trying to keep an eye on and decide how to handle. And hands going up as well. if you could, yeah, I'll try and manage both hands and questions across multiple, but I can't see everybody, so I may not notice all hands going up because of the screen that I'm working off. So if you do want to speak, the best thing to do, even if you just pop something very brief in the chat to let me know that you want to come in and speak rather than a comment, then it means that we can keep track of who wants to come in, then that would be great. And do keep questions coming in the chat as well. So I think I can take people in order, or we can try and bring some of the questions together. Some of them are overlapping. And so I think maybe as an initial question, maybe or a couple of questions which will come in, which overlap, I might just put to the panel, and then we can invite people to come in and offer follow-ups of that. The first is really, I think, two questions which relate to kind of the mechanisms of how planning can be involved in levelling up, perhaps. One is a question from Peter, which is just how would increased planning control contribute to levelling up? And the other is a question from Dinah about whether this is more a question about plan making or about the development, the more regulatory ends of the planning system as we understand it in England. And I wonder if the panel would like to take that question of kind of just trying to explain a little bit more about the mechanisms through which they see the planning system impacting on and being a tool for levelling up.
I could start, Andy, if you like, and possibly just address Dinah's point, which may also address the other point as well, I think, from Peter. I think it's both regulation and it's plan making. Because if we go back to plans, and I don't want to keep harking back to 47, but, or even if we can think about the development plan system introduced in about 1970, what we saw was, I remember being involved in a group on the social aspects of development plans. We were concerned to think about the redistributive effects of where we located facilities, where we located social infrastructure. We were concerned about making sure that there are employment locations, and we kept those, we protected those sites so that we could provide, try to provide jobs for local communities. And so the plan was meant to be for everyone and for all land uses, so that in a way places, obviously in a wider, more strategic structure, but that places could actually function and have everything there, and that included health as well. We were concerned about locating people next to roads and thinking about housing conditions and so on. I'm trying to replace those where they were not fit for purpose. So I think the planning system did start out with that overview about trying to make places better and think about the distribution of benefits. And I think the regulatory part of that, development management, is very much about reinforcing that through decision making. So we had a lot more no's, and we had far fewer decisions on appeal, because the plan itself was stronger in that system. What we seem to have now is where development management and through into the appeal system, it has much more weight than the plan system. So everything's got out of kilter. So if we want to level up, we've got to get a proper plan. The plan has got to be redistributive in its assessment and in its outcomes that it's trying to achieve, and then it has to be reinforced through decision making. I think that's the start of an answer. I think others, I'm sure, can contribute to that.
Does anyone else want to contribute to that? Michael, I can see your hand is raised, and then Bob.
Yes, I'd like to make a comment on that. I mean, it's a really good question, and I think, if we were settling down to write a few thousand words next, this might be a very good focus to think about. How can planning directly contribute to reducing inequality or increasing equality? But let me give you one very specific example. In 2019, a lot of community groups in London spent a lot of time in the public examination stage of a new London plan. And we made an enormous fuss about the equality impact assessment, which was extraordinarily weak, just a box ticking exercise, which many of you will be familiar with box ticking exercises for equality impact assessments. And we were so fierce about it that the inspectors told the GLA to go away and do some more work. And then they came back with some more work, and the inspectors said, no, there still isn't enough. You've got to go away and actually write a paper on what you think the impacts of this plan would be, of each policy one by one, on all the protected groups in the society, which the GLA was forced to do. And it's a very interesting document, though very hidden away. But what it amounts to is saying, on crucial issues, that the London plan really serves needs for middle and top upmarket housing. It, like its predecessors, does far less than meet any target or even set adequate targets to meet the needs for low-cost rental housing, which is where the need is, and that as a result, the backlog of unmet needs in London just builds up and gets worse and worse. Now, it took a lot of community effort to extract that conclusion. And if that had been written on page 1 of the plan, I think it couldn't have appeared. They would have had to have made a different kind of plan. The plan should be addressing these absolutely fundamental equalities issues. And actually, it's addressing essentially real estate interests, or taking the real estate interests as constraints on the extent to which the social needs can be met, because viability considerations have become the absolutely dominant consideration in what can be put in plans and what can be made as planning decisions. So, this is just one little example. It's not little, it's enormous, but it's one example of how a plan that could be and should be something that tackles inequalities actually isn't and could be.
Thanks, Michael. Bob, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to really what Michael said, is that, confronting the sort of development system in any locality now, communities find the system rigged against them. And people say, what can planning do? Well, first of all, the rules need to be changed so that it isn't rigged against them. We've got a situation where, as Michael said, that this idea of sustainable development is just a joke. It really is. It's actually viable development. That's how it's actually judged by the NPPF and by inspectors. And these things can be changed and need to be changed, so that instead of the planning development control system being rigged against communities, it's actually rigged on behalf of communities. And this is the way in which some change can be made, but it has to be made by changing either national government rules or local government being a lot braver. And that's my second point, is that local authorities, planning authorities, need to fight back. If they don't fight back, they're going to be rolled over, and they are being rolled over. And those who fight back, can win. So, this is really at the front line of dealing with planning applications. Some more things can be done, but we have to recognize that is where the front line is. And the developers know it, and they throw marketing millions at it to ensure that they win on that front line.
Thanks, Bob. That's great. I see that Tim's hands up, but I'm going to ask Tim to hold fire, because I'd like us to move along. There's quite a lot of questions in the chat. And the next one, which brings together again several of the comments and questions, is a question around, I suppose, a scale question and around strategic planning. So responding to Andrew's popped in the chat something about the decision to abolish the regional development agencies and regional tier planning. Katrina has made a point about kind of sub-regional planning as a tier and the prospects for that as a means of addressing this agenda. And Vincent has had his hand up very patiently and also wished to ask a question about strategic planning. So Vincent, do you want to come in now and ask that question? And then I can maybe try and bring Tim in after that to say what he wanted to say and to respond to this question as well.
Thank you very much. I wanted to raise the issue of strategic planning and scale for two reasons, but it touches on some of the contributions that have been made. I think the first thing is, in terms of addressing what planning can do, is to recognise that the issue of levelling up is bigger than planning as currently defined and was currently defined in the 47 Act. And therefore the scope of planning has to change. And that touches, I think, on Michael, your point about the way people are constrained what they'll put into plans. Well, my experience is that as planners, we actually have to challenge that. My experience is that I have challenged with my colleagues and the teams I've been in, people who have tried to stop us addressing issues which are now seen as quite central to the climate change agenda, like forestry, even like brownfield development. These were opposed to what we wanted to put in plan, but we insisted on putting them in. And it covered other things like wind farms and so on. We developed new approaches to that. So the issue of scope, and it also relates to scale, that the issues we're dealing with for levelling up are not going to be solved at the local level. That what we have are authorities being asked to do something they're not positioned to do. And Katrina is absolutely right, and she has led nationally, I think, debate, and I really have to thank her for all she's done on that, in recognising that the thing that's missing is a capacity to take strategic decisions, not just at the sub-regional, but also at a national level. And the other difficulty is that any conversation there's been about that strategic planning, if we're talking about the planning system, is people think that regional planning is some form of local planning writ large, when in fact it's a totally different type of plan that's required. It's about resources, it's about non-land use issues, and it's about integration of all sorts of activities. And so we need different types of plans. And we mustn't be afraid of saying, actually, the type of plan we need to address these issues should not get hankered down in legislation and litigation as local plans are. That we want non-statutory, documents which can be very powerful from experience, can produce quickly, can be flexible, a different form of plan to address these issues, in which there still is a very distinct role for the regulatory zonal-based local plan to operate. But without that, and without a change on what we as planners think a plan is, we're not going to make progress. And part of that change is also in terms of the way we engage democratically, because we failed on that one. And the whole work that has been done on participatory democracy in UCL and other parties has to be something that actually planners get hold of and change the way they go about their consultative processes. I just want to make those points of that, because I think what you've done in producing this report, I think is fantastic. I may not agree with everything in it, and I'd love to engage in that. But the point is, you are putting your head above the parapet and putting your view on the table, which too few planners have sought to do. And that's actually why things have actually been introduced in the way they've done it. It's the old Aesop fable about the man going into the forest saying he wanted a twig, and they offered him the smallest tree, and he chopped it down and then made an axe handle out of it and then chopped the rest of the trees down. It's a bit like that in the way the system has been destroyed, and we've let it be destroyed by not standing up and being counted. So I'm thankful for all you've done.
Thanks very much, Vincent, which speaks nicely also to a question by Ollie, or a comment by Ollie in the chat, which was about the link between, I think, the levelling up agenda and the need for uneven development and the diminution of planning over time, and this idea that there's a bigger, broader agenda for planning, more able to tackle some of these questions if we thought beyond the confines of the actually existing system, I think is a very pertinent one. Tim, do you maybe want to come in on those questions around strategic levels of planning and the other issues that Vincent?
Yeah, I will do. Thank you, Andy. I mean, there's just a fascinating sort of blend of questions here, so I don't know how many I can try and sort of sweep in at the same time, probably not very many, but some are very much to the point of sort of asking specifically what planning proposals would we require, but we haven't necessarily gone into that detail that would be really needed. I'd start with the point which to some extent follows on from Vincent's first statements, is that it's a very big challenge here, which is going to require action at all levels of government because it is so big. Philip McCann made a point that Britain is just about as unequal as East Germany and West Germany was in 1989. And if you look at the 30 years of billions and billions and billions of euros that have been thrown at that, and still East Germany is not necessarily completely leveled up with it, West Germany, well, the old West Germany, you can see how big this is. Exactly the same applies in climate change. This is an enormous challenge. This is, you only got to just start thinking about what is implied across the country to try and move in the direction, even in the direction of net zero within, say, 10 years. It's just mind-bogglingly big, both of these things. And so although the specific questions which have been asked are very much to the point about using local plans and so on, and scale issues, I think it's getting our mind around the size of the thing is a good start. And I'm very much in favour of the county level action that Katrina's talking about, and I'd love to hear more of that if we've got time, or at least she can point us to the launch of her next publication on that. But I think that's only one part of the picture. The bigger regional scale that Vincent's talked about is relevant, and I mean, because we've got things like Transport for the North, of course, that shows the scale challenge in, say, somewhere like the North. Already a government's accepted 5 or 6 years ago that you needed that macro regional scale to try and look at, say, transport from Leeds to Manchester or whatever it is. You can't do these things at the very local level altogether. And whilst we've got some perfectly plausible sort of micro things that can be done at community level, which I think is going to be one of the things that's going to be picked up by government, that just won't crack a thing like 50 years of underdevelopment of so many parts of England. So it's partly a matter of ambition, I think, that there's an enormously ambitious agenda here on several fronts, and the specifics of what planning can do for that, I think it is rather difficult to put your finger on. It is this thing about integrated planning at several levels, which is very old style and sounds a bit, it's been said so many times before, but I think it's true. Unless you, for example, the high street situation of where we go shopping and how we use those central parts of towns is just going to be a rolling issue for several years. And unless that can be decided by sort of societal consensus, so that people start becoming comfortable with different ways of managing high streets and so on. If it's just going to be done by picking off by permitted development of this person changing that building and that person changing that building and this person knocking down that and putting up something else under permitted development, it's just going to end up in a monstrous failure across particularly the poorest areas where the market is weakest. So there's sort of big strategic issues here involved. So I shall shut up and Andy point forward to some more questions.
Thanks. Do any of the other panelists want to come in on those questions around strategic levels of ambition and the scope of planning, which we've been discussing? Or Katrina, did you want to come in and add anything further on your point, as Tim invited, around sub-regional level planning questions?
Yeah, thanks. It's just I think he was asking about the report that I'm just about to publish. It's County Council Network and myself have been doing some work around decision making and governance in strategic planning, and it's some follow-up work to work we did last year in response to the white paper on planning, which looked at what should replace or could replace the duty to cooperate. And I think the conclusion we came to was no matter what sort of strategic planning product you have, and actually regardless of really what geography you operate across, unless you get the decision making right and the accountability right, then whatever we put in place next, we'll just end up with the same sort of situation where some of these really difficult decisions around housing numbers, around climate change, around infrastructure investment will still take a long time. And a lot of they just simply won't be made in the interest of the greater good. So this report, I'm hoping is going to be published within the next couple of weeks by County Council Network, and I'm hoping it will offer government a way forward that sort of ticks a lot of the boxes and addresses head on the issues around levelling up and as I put in the chat there, it's not, for me, it's not just about levelling up geographically across the country. It is about levelling up across tiers of government and genuinely devolving some of these really big decisions down to local government, but in a way that the governance system can actually cope with them. And we don't end up with a lot of local authority leaders taking brave decisions and losing their heads, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Katrina. It's really interesting. There have been a couple of other points, I think, around the governance system and around kind of the level of centralisation of the state and the ways in which that perhaps contributes to levelling up or makes it harder to address or tackle questions of uneven development. Maybe move on now. There was a couple of questions which addressed issues around land values as well, and land value capture, which I think are pertinent. One was Dinah, who's unfortunately had to leave, I think, but was interested in questions of how you distribute and the distributive consequences of those mechanisms, which I think are very interesting. And the other is Tony Crook's comment around, I suppose, how much land value is available to capture and what sort of a contribution that can make to the levelling up agenda. So I don't know, did anyone want to come in immediately on that?
Can I just respond to Tony Crook's comment? I was amazed that we're gaining 50% of development value. Is that what's being said, or I know that Tony Crook's done the key research on this over a good number of years. So if I'm understanding that right, I just can't imagine that sort of in the area around Oxford, for example, we the community are getting 50% of the value. Am I sort of understanding or misunderstanding?
Tony, did you want to briefly come in and set that out for us, if that's okay?
Andy, yes. Well, it's a calculation that Christine Whitehead and sadly no longer with us, John Hennebury, and I did in some of our evidence to one of the select committees. So I think it varies within the country, but on average, in fiscal 18-19, Silland Section 106 took 30% of betterment value, i.e. the increase in land value following planning consent. Capital gains tax took, together with stamp duty land, took another 20. So the 30% is hypothecated, it goes to local authorities, they spend it in accordance with their plans. The other 20% goes into the treasury. It's clearly not hypothecated, and clearly, Tim, it varies between local authorities, different types of development. It will be less on brownfield. I think the question I was posing there is if we still need incentives for landowners to bring land forward and, appropriate margins made by developers, is there more that we can take? I have argued with Christine, and John argued too, and we agree with Kate Barker, that one of the approaches must be more formal partnerships using the model of master plan consent areas in Scotland that they now have provided within the 2019 Planning Act, where you get a partnership between landowners, local authorities to bring that land forward. It builds on the New Towns model, but it brings in active participation of funders to do that. So I think you need a different approach. One, we've got major development where some form of public land ownership, maybe with participation, sorry, Andy, I can't say the word, from other funders is involved. I mean, elsewhere, continuing with a kind of a tariff approach to make it much easier. I mean, my own view, which I'm on record of saying this in some further work we've done, and you'll all have seen the paper that John, Christine and I did for Town and Country Planning, is the proposed system is going to be even more complex than the current one. Let's work with the way we do things at the moment, but deal with the things which are going wrong. And I think there are quite a lot of lessons from Scotland here. Sorry, Andy, I hope that's an answer to the question.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Tony. And I see that Michael wants to come in, and Bob also keen to come in on this question. So, Michael, you're muted, unfortunately.
I wanted to add what I think is a tremendously important point to what Tony Crook has said. I don't dispute his calculation, and I've often found it really very helpful reading that stuff. It's really good. But we must remember that the land values and the growth of land values affects not only new developments which get planning permission so that the land value shoots up, producing this development gain, which some percentage of which can be appropriated through these various mechanisms, but it affects the rest of the building stock as well. So that the money value of the entire owner-occupier stock of housing in Britain is, I can't remember how many trillions of pounds, something like 6 trillion. And of course, there's all the commercial and industrial floor space and built land as well. And what is a problem from the point of view of inequality and wealth distribution is that this colossal mass of land-related wealth largely evades taxation. A little bit of it, which is represented by new development projects, does get a bit captured through Section 106 and so on. But the capital growth associated with the standing stock of, if you like, secondhand buildings and land that is not currently being developed is massive. And we need to think about all of that in thinking about forms of taxation, how to replace, how to deal with local government finance, how to deal with wealth tax, how to deal with the spatial and non-spatial aspects of levelling up. So, you know, there's a bigger picture if you zoom out than there is when you focus in on the development process.
Andy, if I could, I mean, I absolutely agree with Michael. That was dealing with a rather small part of it. I mean, we're on record of saying that what we need is a complete reform of property taxation, which isn't a mess. I'm volunteering to pay capital gains tax on the increase in my house. I live in a lovely village in the Peak District National Park where, Andy knows, and probably my house price went up £100 while we've been talking, if not literally. And this is totally ridiculous because I'm a beneficiary of planning policies and I ought to be taxed on that benefit. I won't go on and on and on, but clearly we are doing a little bit to capture development value when it's created through development. We need to really think very carefully about how we capture the value which our constraints are giving to people like me.
Yeah, I hadn't realised that both Michael and Tony volunteering to use this session to actually level things up and to admit their wealth and to consider how to redistribute it. So we've actually, it's good to hear.
Well, Andy, I think don't we have to live our beliefs? Sorry to be slightly pious.
No, sounds good to me. Thanks. Bob, did you want to come in on this question too?
Yeah, I'd just like to talk with Tony, so much more about this, because it seems to me that figure he's come up with, 30 to 50%, is a pretty big underestimate in my judgment. I've not done the kind of detailed research, but I mean, what about the developer's profit? I mean, if that's 20% of the value and that's taken out and accepted as being reasonable, then that's a loss of value to the community right there. And then there's the amount of value created over time. I mean, actually, Section 106 in the seal is just a snapshot. It's taken usually at the point when consent is granted. But I mean, land values increase on a site deliberately. I mean, that's what house builders do deliberately. They're looking for increases in value over time. And if you're looking at things like value over time and say, how much of this value over time has been captured by the community, it's far less than the amount that you're suggesting, I think, Tony. But this is enough for another discussion.
I think it would be a really rich discussion, and maybe it's worth a follow-up piece of work, an event or similar. It does strike me as incredibly interesting, and certainly I think this idea that land is close to the root of many of the issues that we might face in thinking about levelling up, given this kind of the broader economic model, if it even is that, which has been in place in this country over recent decades, and the centrality of land values and property values and asset values to that model, I think means that it has to be a central consideration. So I'm going to try and move things on a bit further as well, if that's all right. And is anyone really itching to come in on that question, or are you happy for me to move things along?
Well, maybe I'll take a slightly different angle on that and say, well, if we don't look at climate change, for instance, if we don't properly acknowledge or respect flood risk, for example, what's that going to do to property values in areas of high flood risk, sea level rise, that kind of thing? So there are different factors coming in terms of climate impacts that will affect land values, and the investment that we need to put in right now, because it takes such a long time for this infrastructure to be built to protect these places, you know, that isn't forthcoming anywhere close to the scale that's required, and we're running out of time to build it. So we're kind of locking in the damage because we won't be able to build the protection that we need in time, or to address the issues in time.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Naomi. It does add in a richer perspective. And I know there's there's an exchange going on in the chat, which is really interesting as well, where Rose has posted some other research, and Elena makes a point about rent and its impact on land values and property values, and how that contributes to these issues. So this is a big topic area that we could presumably go on discussing all afternoon. Duncan, I can see that your hand's up. Is it up to come in on this particular issue?
Yes, it is, because I mean, I put a comment in the chat which in response to Tony, and I'm surprised that it hasn't been picked up, because I think we're, you know, making heroic assumptions about the relationship between devolution and levelling up. I mean, giving local authorities more ability to raise land value tax doesn't help authorities where, you know, the values are low and there's very little land value tax to be generated. And this whole argument that more devolution solves, you know, the issue of regional inequities is fundamentally ill-conceived, because we fundamentally need a central government that's actually committed to redistributing wealth, assets, investment to the areas that actually need it, that can't actually self-finance it. And devolution without a central government redistribution mechanism, whether it's on property tax or business rates or whatever, just reinforces regional inequity. The whole idea that every region can be self-sufficient if it just has more powers to use its own resources, to me is just complete nonsense. I mean, the whole issue of, you know, that London argued in terms of the Mayor's London Finance Commission, supported by Tony Travers, that London should keep all its property tax, which is more than 50% of property tax in the country, is just a way of reinforcing the privileged wealth of London. I think we've just got to be really serious about how we consider this, and that we recognise that certain decisions need to be made at national level, certain at regional level, some through growth area collaboration, which we've been discussing earlier, and some at local level. I mean, I also think the arguments that some people are putting forward that local consultation solves all of this, you know, completely fails to deal with the issue that, you know, there are local conflicting interests, and some people in a stronger position to protect their interests and sort everybody else than others. So you do actually need a structure that is democratically accountable at a number of levels. And, you know, having this discussion without tackling those fundamental dilemmas doesn't really take us forward very much. Sorry to be so strong on this, but I mean, we are ducking so many of the key issues in this discussion, and also bluntly to a certain extent in the paper.
So that's an interesting challenge to the authors of the paper around whether or not the distributive question is taken seriously enough, and whether the governance mechanisms required to enable that kind of redistribution are taken seriously enough. Does anyone want to come back at Duncan on that before we move things along?
I mean, I could just come back and say I agree entirely. I mean, as I was talking back, you know, when we had the post-war settlement, it was based on the assumption that we would have redistribution, whether that was through, at the time, regional policy, whether it was through what happened in terms of rates and so on. You know, the fact is that funding was redistributed, probably not well enough, but nevertheless the principle was there, and that's eroded now to the point of non-existence. And if you just look at, for example, the removal of the revenue support grant, which was one of the last vestiges of that redistribution, we look at what's happening on business rates, for example, and the promised changes there, which have never occurred. So I'm 100% with Duncan. It does need a national redistribution settlement, a set of principles. But on the other hand, you know, we still need to address why people who live very close to each other have a difference of 15 years in their life expectancy. And this is in the southeast as well as in the northeast. So, you know, and I'm not saying planning can solve that issue, but at least we need to be aware of it and thinking, what are there things that we can do? Is this because of air quality? Is it because of poverty? Is it because it's no access to transport or jobs? Is it lack of education? What is it? And what's planning's contribution to dealing with that, but within this bigger framework? So yeah, I'm with you 100%, Duncan, on that.
Thanks, Janice. Tim, is your hand, I see your hands up, is that a hand for now, or is it a legacy of?
No, it's again me now. Can I just follow on briefly from this last point? I think that certainly I don't think you're going to get a lot of disagreement about the centrality of redistribution, spatial and non-spatial, and a need for taxation, and therefore the importance of central government decisions really is what that comes down to. But more the area of disagreements, I guess, that will be floating around in this session and elsewhere, the sort of way you put local government in all of this. And I just wanted to mention really, don't try and say it as a separate point later, that I'm sort of intrigued as how we can sort of change the debate in favour of local government, because there seems to be sort of the fact that local government's gone out of the ministry title now seems to be a warning to people that local government is going to be sort of treated even less favourably than it has been by recent governments. And really it's a sort of question to the gathering here as to what will help to sort of help local government's corner in a way, because it seems to me that that's almost a sort of, well, it is a political point and an ideological point, because as far as I can see, the Conservatives don't like local government, but it's a practical point as to where it seems to be planning without local government strength is useless, and vice versa, you know, local government strength without planning is useless. So the two need to be sort of saved together in order to get any progress on these agendas. So it's just a question to anybody who's got any bright ideas as to how to help local government.
Thanks, Tim. Michael, did you want to come in on that as well? And then I will.
Yes, I wanted to add another point in response to Duncan Bowie's very correct and admirable comment. I mean, we had a problem in writing this little pamphlet because, you know, it's not a royal commission on everything. We were trying to focus on the aspects of levelling up which were essentially spatial or had a spatial or geographical dimension to them. So we were avoiding talking about what you might call the totally non-spatial dimensions, sort of macroeconomic policy in general, systems of taxation in general, systems of subsidies, you know, even thinking about universal credit, uplifts and its cancellation. All these things are clearly absolutely crucial factors in determining levels of equality and inequality. So this made us make some cut-offs which do leave some very raw ends which we didn't deal with adequately. So we referred here and there to the need for a rethink on land value taxation or on local government finance, but we didn't work it through. And Duncan, you're absolutely right that, of course, any move towards a change in local government finance or land value taxation or total property value taxation absolutely must make redistribution between regions or between localities according to some needs formula or something absolutely central. You're dead right. But that's somehow a whole set of issues I suppose we were trying to avoid in order to write a small, compact pamphlet. So it's our fault.
Thanks, Michael. Mea culpa. Yeah, so that's really helpful. I know that Vincent has added into the chat reference to the UK 2070 Commission and a link to their report, which is worth looking at in relation to these questions.
But we do support that quite strongly. We support their approach to regional level redistribution of revenues and so on.
I'm going to try and move things along, if that's all right. I know your camera coming on there, Vincent. Apologies. We've got a couple of other things that would be interesting to discuss, which have come up in the chat, topics which have been mentioned by a couple. One is, Rose raised the question around the value of levelling up, which I think speaks to Tim's concern about the political and the ideological in all of this, and how you respond to something as amorphous and seemingly without definition as an agenda without an agenda, which is clearly doing lots of political work, which may be very different to any practical work which it's doing, and which is clearly intended to do that kind of work. And I think it raises an interesting question for us, whether a report like this takes an agenda too seriously, which is really a political device being used by a particular government, or whether, as Rose suggests, I think that it's something that we can use to hold the government to account to some extent around a set of promises around tackling uneven development. So I think it raises some quite profound challenges. Rose, did you want to add anything to your comment before we see whether anyone wants to respond to it?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just say that my comment is very much inspired by my experiences as part of the No Place Left Behind Commission that was set up by the Create Streets Foundation and chaired by Toby Lloyd. We looked at what place means for levelling up. What role, why have places declined so much in terms of their physical fabric, and what has that meant for people's feelings of being left behind? And when we were doing this work, one of the things that really struck me was how many recent housing and planning policies really go precisely against the change that I think government says that it wants in towns and cities across the North and the Midlands. So as much as it is an amorphous concept, and I get that lots of commentators are irritated by levelling up at this point because we keep hearing about it, but there's no definition around it, no clear accountability around it. I do think it's something that we can use. It's basically the only thing government has demonstrated that it's committed to doing beyond dealing with the immediate crises of the pandemic, Brexit, and the consequences of those things. The one thing they keep putting money into and making speeches about is levelling up. So I'd suggest that we find ways to use it and point out the contradictions. In the same way as did happen very successfully with permitted development rights and the whole beauty agenda that Jenrick led. Now, of course, we do still have PDR. I wouldn't say that Bassett is won by a long way, but we have made some progress. We do have some restrictions. We at least have windows in new PDR homes. We have space standards. I think all of that stuff was won because people, including people in this Zoom chat, took the time to point out the contradictions between what government said it was doing and what it was actually doing. And I think we would get something from doing the same with levelling up as well, because there are clear contradictions.
Thanks, Rose. That's really helpful and addition to the conversation, I think, and slightly changes our focus towards the kind of politics and how we respond to the politics of the agenda. Did anyone on the panel want to come in and say anything to that or in response to that? No one's jumping.
Well, I think if I can add a comment that I think it's certainly important, as Rose says, that we go on looking for contradictions, looking for imperfections, looking for the downside of the things that this dreadful government does and trying to get them into the public eye. And I was sorry in a way that Ben Clifford didn't come. I think he was going to come, but he was too busy, because the work that he did with Janice on PDR has been tremendously effective in showing what slums are being produced by that mechanism. Just what we would all have predicted, but it's helpful to have some empirical work which demonstrates that it really happens. And clearly there's quite a lot of damage limitation and can be done to try and tackle some of the worst impacts. But I suppose today's meeting and the pamphlet is mainly trying to look behind all that, which we shall undoubtedly all be doing, but to think what are the longer term battles we've got to fight.
Thanks, Michael.
Can I comment on that, Andy, on Rose's point?
Sure. Thanks, Vincent.
It seems to me, Rose, you raised a very significant point, which is the issue about definition. The reason why I think it's actually had so much traction is that actually people do know what it's about. They do know about the differences in quality of life between one part of the country and another, or between one part of a city and another. And in fact, those who try and kill off the idea by saying it needs great definition and it's all so complicated, actually, I'm sure also understand that we are suffering unacceptable levels of inequality in this country. I think the policy issue that's posed, and the one that the Commission that has been mentioned that I'm involved with is try to address with, is to recognise that it operates at two fundamental levels. One is intra-regional, or intercity. So even where I live, Oxford has its problems of inequality, or else as opposed to the interregional, which is to do with the structure of our economy and our financial mechanisms. And that the two are interlinked, but require different and complementary policy responses. And I think what we can bring to the table is clarity about that, to help on a way through that. And Duncan didn't mention it, but Duncan has shown leadership in putting together people and writing a report that went out about a month or 6 weeks ago, Duncan, which talks about the issues which touch on this, about the problems we have in the southeast, London and the wider southeast, which are just as acute and need their own response, but are part of that national problem of addressing inequality. And anyone who doesn't understand it is almost, in my view, a flat earther. You know, they, in terms of don't believe the earth is round, that in fact you cannot help but see the inequalities in our society and understand them. And I think that we just have to help avoid it being destroyed by kind of casuistic arguments, which seem to undermine the fact that we have an unjust society and we need to address those issues.
I've just put the link to the London Wider South East report in the chat.
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks, Vincent. I still think there's a question there that maybe you're not quite addressing of the potential political uses of a label like that, and of very big differences in sincerity and desire to tackle an understanding of the issues of uneven development, which I think are quite fascinating. I've always thought it's very interesting that we have a Conservative government that needs to use a discourse of levelling up, which is a discourse which acknowledges inequality as a problem. That, to me, I think suggests that there's a space which is interesting, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done to turn that into a serious agenda for tackling the root causes of those issues. Bob,
and
did you?
To be honest, it's a cross-party issue. I must just correct some maybe odd balance. This issue has been going on for 50 years, and all parties have had some responsibility in where we are now. And I think we need to recognise that and say that there is chance now for a kind of new rebasing of the way we do things in this country.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that is that, and I very much agree with what Rose was saying. But I think the reason why levelling up is on the agenda for this government is actually quite cynical. It's about electoral opportunism. It's not really about redistribution or levelling up or whatever. It's just they seized on this because of the somewhat unexpected outcome of the 2019 election. They really want to confirm that coalition that they've established by talking about levelling up the whole time. And I think that's the reason why a lot of the interventions so far have been, plainly pork barrel related. And I see there's a report in the Independent newspaper today saying that, that there's more of that coming along with ministers, constituencies getting support through so-called levelling up interventions. So, I mean, I think, I'm sorry, we have to regard this somewhat cynically. And And we would like it to be taken seriously. We'd like them to be looking at a whole nation approach to this. I don't believe they are. Where in a way this report is trying to test out, saying, well, look, prove to us that you're not being completely cynical here. Prove to the general public this isn't just an opportunist short-term gain, short-term electoral opportunity. But as Rose says, this is sadly the only game in town at the moment in terms of the way the government describes their interventions. I mean, everything, as we said, is packaged or branded under as levelling up for that particular reason. That's got to be that particular claim has got to be punctured. And that but the other part of our job is to really, in a way, save planning. I mean, that's a lot of us are in here because we believe there is some, as Janice has said, some good social value in planning. And trying to sort of say, well, look, if you're serious about levelling up, if you at all, then you have to start getting serious about the planning system and reinvigorating and reinstating it. And it's another test to throw at them. And I think that's our job, is to keep throwing out these tests and all these challenges, recognizing that we're dealing with, in my opinion, a deeply cynical government approach to levelling up.
Thanks, Bob. Did anyone else want to chip in on that question of the politics and responding to an agenda being set?
I think I could sort of roughly add in that area that, I mean, there's different approaches we could have taken or can take to this. One is to be practical, if you like, which there's several people on this call, like Rose, who are actually in there being practical, if you like, trying to influence the agenda. We, I think, are sort of one step across from that. We're sort of both analysing and, if you like, campaigning, I suppose is one word, of trying to get the planning reforms to be seriously addressing this question. The third one will be what I would call ideological analysis, and in my view, that will be a very different pamphlet or approach, which to some extent it's in there because of the politics of the writers, but that says that we're addressing two issues which are so enormous, levelling up and climate change and so on questions, which we don't expect the current government, which represents roughly the sort of ruling class status quo of this country, we don't expect this government to tackle those. Ideologically, they're not able to. They created much of this situation, along with a lot of other forces of the problems in those two areas, and it's not in their genes to tackle it, and therefore the question would then be what ideological program would be in its genes to tackle it. And we certainly are not going to get into the question of the Labour Party or anything like that. But that seems to me the sort of medium-term one, that third approach of the ideological critique, if you like, which I think is very interesting. But it's not what we tried to do in this pamphlet. We were sort of in that middle position, not just being sort of pragmatic and trying to get in there, but we were trying to have an effect on the current agenda. So we're sort of in that middle position, I think, of neither pure ideological critique, which can be a bit talking to yourself, and we haven't got a foot in the door like some people here have. So, I mean, to be quite, I'm with Bob's cynicism, really. I mean, basically, they're not going to pick up what we've just written in this pamphlet. I think their response is going to be an anti-planning response, and they're going to try and tackle the next 3 years by pork barrel politics, in other words, throwing money at the right bits, and they're going to do it because it's not with their ideology, which is an anti-planning ideology. So, but nevertheless, the point has to be made, and I think that's what we've been trying to do. We're making these points.
Thanks, Tim. I'm conscious of time. We're about 10 to when we said we might finish. People are beginning to drift off into their evenings, I think. So I'm thinking that we maybe should begin to call things to halt. I've also got to get back home across inadequate northern infrastructure, which is obviously a thing. I think we maybe will draw it to close. I know a few questions which we haven't picked up on in the chat, and I've been a bit selective surfing through questions and trying to pull them together. And so apologies if we didn't get around to your questions. I think, and I hope we've had a really rich discussion of what is a huge set of challenges and questions and issues that go far beyond the current government's agenda, really, to address some of these underlying issues of uneven development, but also broader questions of what's coming down the line in the future in terms of responses to the climate crisis, to inequality, to some really major challenges, and the potential role of planning in playing a part in that, and a broader part in that than I think has been the case for some time in a country now dominated by a very narrow conception of planning as effectively the regulation of house building. I hope that everybody's enjoyed the discussion. I hope we can find ways to continue it. Do read the pamphlet, download it from the TCPA website. If you're interested in further engagement and discussion and thinking about how we build momentum behind some of these ideas, these are all things that we're interested in, and we're likely to be, or we are going to be continuing to discuss. So please do get in touch, keep the conversations going. And yeah, thank you very much for all of your contributions. And particular thanks to the panel for taking the time to write the pamphlet and for presenting it to us this afternoon. Thanks everybody, and cheers.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for chairing so well.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody.
We're left with 11 people, now 10.
Very good. Well done that you managed to sort out, Michael, in the end. That
No, I don't know.
that difficulty.
I can't understand why it was such a shambles, but I really am sorry.
Right. It was,
Down to me somehow.
Right.
Me and Zoom between us.
Right. Okay.
In the end, and I think we had enough time for the energy for the discussion that was in the room. I think we maybe lost a few people who had to head off. Would have been around from 4 till 5:30, but
Yeah. No, it recovered. It recovered okay. I think you chaired it very well. So
I thought you did a brilliant job of chairing it, Andy.
Thanks so
really
much,
good.
Andy.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you.
no.
Very nice.
I'm
glad you were well enough to come. Let's hope it's not going to get worse.
Yeah, no, me too.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Good. Okay.
Well,
All right. All the best, everybody. Cheers.
Yeah. Okay. Bye. It's
Thank you
just
so
sets a
much.
few challenges to think about.
Yes.
Cheers. Thanks.
I've saved the chat as well, which I think will be interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.